Hello everyone, today we talk about the development of naval tactics from ancient Greece to the Viking era, mostly concentrating, of course, on classical times, given the more intense and larger scaled naval warfare. This is not the first time, of course, we address these topics in part, but we still have to do a lot. We never talked about, for example, about Hellenistic navies that were quite impressive. They're admittedly less documented than, say, the Hellenic, classical Hellenic ones, let's say, of the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian War. However, there is a also broader homogeneity in the logic of naval warfare of the time. We will also expand at some point into later medieval naval warfare, which is quite interesting, and at times we also observed. In any case, there are some fundamentals we can look at today, and from the transformation of which over time reveals the major, in fact, changes of the art of war at sea and the polities, the militaries that expressed them. As you know, in general, naval warfare was very subsidiary to the land one, right? There weren't actually that many major, especially naval engagements in antiquity. At large, there is also a time of wide pacification, especially at the peak of Roman power in the Mediterranean. Thus, of course, these naval changes correspond to that political background. We focus on tactics, though, so to the actual technicalities. At times we will look, as we have already begun doing, the various ships types and other nautical aspects of the same. So, ancient naval tactics can be very sketchily categorized into two main schools of thought. One that emphasize maneuverability, and as a consequence, mostly the use of the ramming tactics that were incredibly complicated to perform. We will have to make a video entirely on that. And another that viewed ships primarily as transports for troops to board enemy vessels. That was the sort of most obvious and practical way of war. Regardless of the complications of the ram, it's understandable that at the end of the day, that tactic, doesn't matter how ancient, was never truly prevalent. Like, battles at large were not really won by ramming per se, also because today we will not really look at this more than much. We have done it in other videos, also the ones about Renaissance galley warfare, for example, that are also much better documented historically wise. Naval battles were largely fought in a similar way to land ones. Essentially, there were multiple battle lines that were witnessed like this severe ranks compaction, and then essentially these forces crashing against one another, cramming themselves into fundamentally and mostly boarding, because as you understand, there wasn't much room for maneuvering in among unmasked ships, and basically the winner was the guy who managed to at times also to outflank the enemy formation, to attack from the rear, the flank, but finally breaking the enemy battle line that lost say cohesion, allowing for essentially the enemy to swarm through the enemy formation and finally dismantling it. Naturally, it's not quite literally the same thing as a land warfare, because a man or a horse do not behave as entire ship's crews, and the actual ships, there is a different physics, different forces involved, but at large, right, when you look at the large scale dynamic, it's fundamentally the same. Now, historically, while the ram-focused school achieved notable victories, because they did happen, exploiting, in fact, maneuverability, speed, agility, it was ultimately boarding tactics that prevailed as the dominant approach. right? The reason it's just ramming is an overly sophisticated and fundamentally technological concept, and as you know, that does not really work in the bigger picture of strategy. And these naval engagements were essentially mirroring the necessity of bringing on the enemy decks the same armies that would have fought on land. We've seen this also in multiple videos dedicated to historical marine units, such as the milites glaciari, that in that case, in Roman warfare, did not really differ from Roman legionaries. Some equipment could differ because fighting at sea on enemy decks, etc., is slightly different from fighting in major units in open field, etc., with more space to maneuver and so on. But at the end of the day, we're looking at the same identical thing. This is true for any era at the end of the day. We'll talk also more about 18th century naval warfare. We will really have a lot of naval military history ahead. In any case, the dominance of boarding stemmed from the fact that the ram was the only weapon that could effectively destroy an enemy ship, which required what? Direct engagement, a situation that aligned perfectly with the goals of the boarding school. And we will see now what kind of ballet existed, as it technically does happen also on land, but in fact with with different options, or at least timings and spaces. In other words, even if you managed to smash into an enemy ship, you wouldn't necessarily sink that. You could even remain stuck into it. In any case, they could simply harpoon you to reverse marines on your decks, and if the entire point is that you were trying to outmaneuver them because at large you were worse at hand-to-hand combat, well, you were essentially getting yourself into the place where, yes, you could achieve some temporary advantage, and even at large winning a battle with this ramming tactics representing the tip of the balance, but definitely not the bottom of the iceberg. That was in fact always about your own same boarding tactics. Like, there weren't fleets that did only ramming or boarding. It happened at the same time, but depending on the strategic balance, we would prefer sort of softening up the enemy before getting to hand-to-hand combat, or vice versa. I made a video about the Battle of Cape Economos, for example, where there is a beautiful representation of this. The Carthaginians were better at maneuvering, and so they feigned flight. They tried to track the Romans in some other places, but the Romans are instead just chasing them because they are stronger in close combat, and at the end of the day, they manage to hook the enemy ships and to crush them. And of course, it was all about also, we can say combined arms because there are different arms at sea, but truly combined tactics, like of different units, hopefully, again, breaking the enemy lines, falling on the enemy rear, and so something that is very similar to land combat. The ram had been a characteristic feature of galleys long before established tactics were developed for its role as a primary weapon. Boarding was instead there since the dawn of warfare, right? It's perhaps underrated how most natural and direct boarding is, even with very primitive ships. We will see this surely in some videos about Bronze Age warfare, but also what we can know about prehistory. Now, going back to the ram, though, it's believed that the Phocians devised formal ramming tactics around the mid-first millennium BC. Naturally, there is a relative focus and concentration on Hellenic warfare because it's better documented, as we were saying before. But I mean, think about the Phoenicians or other sailors of antiquity. Ramming would have been there, right? What we witnessed, though, in Hellas at large is this sort of intensive care towards very, thought out tactics, like a certain predisposition towards technology, a great deal of societal and political dynamism, the polis and their mercantile potential. So these were powers who devised more qualitatively, let's say, effective naval tactics to a degree that was not just a mere power policy, like you could see, for example, in the case of, say, the Achaemenid navy or armies when they invaded Greece, right? They knew very well how to go at sea, but there were some greater dynamics there at play that would eventually favor the Greeks, that won also thanks to luck, because you can never win without luck in any case. And that's something we were talking about the other day, for that matter, for the Battle of Marathon, right? For the rest, also, when we look at these peoples, you have more or less by now realized, by following Schwerpunkt, that they were all very similar at the time, right? Some changes in ships' designs and technology were, of course, very important for the time, but they weren't sudden. They happened very slowly, and at large, everybody could have that, right? And much more important factors were banally just the quantity of the overall force, how it was handled, leadership, morale. That's what really matters, not what kind of ship per se or what kind of technology per se. But when you look at the latter, you realize it's an adaptation to those very particular political and strategic needs. In fact, also when we look at to classical Greece in general, you know that by the 30s of the 5th century we have the Athenian thalassocracy. That would unavoidably be the context in which ramming would have been sort of fully refined, whatever that means. I mean, in that specific context. I also made a video about the Athenian Navy, right, making a bit of cost comparisons with today's US one, which is strikingly similar in terms of actual investment and naval projection, economical, military relation. So by this time, the Athenians viewed boarding tactics as somewhat outdated even. This is a bit of an exaggeration, but Thucydides literally says that the older method, right, of boarding, as if that had been somehow, just a primitive one, and now, the Athenians had this, of course, more agile ships that had been so important for that reason at Salamis, except just that had been the peak of glory. But of course, even if you look at that battle, you realize, as we were saying at the beginning, that it was all about fundamentally like massive bulks of ships thrown at one another, and that the space for maneuvering was, of course, quite limited, even when it was performed in the overall strategic vanity. Now, the key element of ramming maneuvers, of course, was to outmaneuver the enemy and strike at their flank, which is just, in absolute strategic terms, not a simple thing to do. First of all, because the enemy will have deployed in a way that will, at least the wider the line at large, and this is also what was reflected from land warfare for the same military logical reasons, would directly dilute that flanking capacity to smaller forces, and if even this had been bigger, like, they would have been subtracted to your own line. And that flanking capacity is mostly subordinated to different factors, either, surprise, for example, feign flight, any kind of opportunity that you may not see there. There are lots of things at sea that can go different. We could wind, first of all. So we already made multiple videos about naval battles, observing how, there are much bigger factorial combinations than the type of ship or the individual tactic that will bring to the outcome. Flanking maneuvers are always devastating, because if you succeed in them, it means that you have successfully placed the enemy in a condition of asymmetry and therefore of inferiority. of course, you would have not put yourself in the opposite one by yourself. And it has also a devastating psychological effect, right? You oblige him to react in that same condition, etc. As we've seen in other videos already, two main tactics were established for the purpose of ramming. There are sort of the most famous ones, and they are actually very simple: the diak and the periplus. Both tactics assumed that the enemy would adopt a standard line abreast formation and were rooted in a line-astern maneuvering approach, which, as a condition, is not really what you're going to find all the time. A line abreast means in line, like just like in a normally wider formation than a deeper one, and say a line astern ideally is just like an actual line. But of course, the wooden, these are especially the latter is an extreme, and before performing that, you must have very good reasons in order to do so. Always bear in mind that there is all there are those topics, about Trafalgar, the T-crossing, those. We'll get there in a broader sense, but I would like to stress how, even in that case, even when you succeed in these maneuvers, it's mostly not just a matter of specific finesse, it's just about major strategic quantities. And, for example, in that case, mostly getting into a brutal hand-to-hand, or at least close range combat, that will much favor the better one in that manner. It's, again, as we've seen also Cape Economus, etc. So even an extreme diak tactics would have, so the one entering, at least ideally entering, in fact, I do not know any engagement where it was like a single line of ships, like constituting the entire fleet. We know of columns of some kind, yes, to enter the enemy lines, but at large, the objective there is demolishing, like, the enemy, or at least cutting through the enemy line, and hopefully attacking from the rear, which is also, however, countered in different ways. Now, briefly, the periplus, as also the current word, the periple says, involves essentially going around the enemy's exposed side to hit their rear or flank, whatever, while the diak required passing between enemy ships, again, breaking through their line. Hopefully, also in terms of an individual ship against ship, because that's what we would have also got into, damaging the enemy oars in the process and sort of preserving as much as you can your own, which is a bit difficult. You're going to get damage yourself, but at least you can take the enemy by an angle that can basically break most of them. The further move being like a pivot to target the enemy's vulnerable back, much like the periplus itself. In fact, they were practically the same, except, I mean, the periplus was wheeling around the entire formation, the diak just breaking through it, but ultimately just for getting behind the enemy line and attacking it at that point from the rear and or from the side. This is so much obvious also for land battles. We've seen it many times. The diak was particularly effective for smaller groups of ships, individual vessels. Sometimes in full fleets you do see something similar, but it starts being ever more complicated, and you can perform that only if you have an incredible advantage of some sort, at least tendentially. That because you must have multiple ships, like in depth, like with a narrow front, against an enemy that at large must not have a great depth information. Consider, again, you depend on ultimately like the guy in front of you. And this is paradoxically more similar to cavalry than infantry warfare, if we want to make a parallelism with land forces, because just like in cavalry charges, you know, that there were multiple ranks, but normally just the first or the first couple would actually charge straight into the enemy. The other one would actually slow down. We're talking still at a relatively close distance from the enemy to intimidate him, and in order to at that point like exploit any gap that may have formed. Because if you just if you just follow the guy in front of you and say this did not break through, you would have simply smashed into him, and so causing a disaster along at least the file. And you understand that in naval warfare this problem is increased because the more ships you convoy, you're channeling to that line of advance, and of course at large the more difficult is for them to simply be stopped or to be redeployed if the first one doesn't actually break through. So of course, as we were saying at the beginning, also in major naval engagements you can find mostly flank attacks, like there are capacities to outmaneuver the enemy, etc. It's all possible, but at large, especially the deck blows will not be, so that the frontal one and that one will not be that frequent, because there would be multiple layers of ships, and there is just so much that a ship, even launched at full speed with full rowing force, can do against multiple lines of ships. By the way, are usually chained together as well, so at some point you can't even practically perform that tactic, so that it would get to much more nitty and gritty actions, such as boarding the enemy ships, like breaking the chain, unchaining, in fact, these connections, and gradually managing to, I don't know, sink a ship, getting the hell out of the way, having other ship entering the enemy formation, and so on. It's much more complicated. And so it's much more effective at that point to have as many ships in the front line as the enemies, right? So that you can counter one another, and at least that's what most of the line will. That's why a line exists to begin with, and at that point it's mostly boarding, in fact. These maneuvers, nevertheless, were important. They relied on the proficiency of well-trained fleets and crews. There was a tremendous difficulty in correctly performing boarding. The Marines on deck had to literally move, they were trained to literally move on the surface of the ship in order to adjust like the entire mass balance before impact, in tandem of course with the rowers' rhythm. There is momentum. It's very difficult to simply steer at some, especially when you're full speed, so and you have to hit at that specific angle. Much of this is a gamble. It's literally like smashing to like a horse, well, a bit less dangerous at large into the enemy line, but just to give an idea of how many things can actually go wrong. And it's still just something happening every once in a while. This is not overwhelmingly typical. Of course, there was historically some capacity of this kind. Like we've seen it in different naval campaigns and battles, strategic and tactical decisions taken on the basis of how good, how more experienced, how better in terms of performance capabilities a side would be compared to the other, right? And so tendentially, the hope of the less agile fleet was to just pin the enemy in a location where these maneuvers at large were not so easy to perform, and just overwhelming them with other qualities. So numbers, just the marine combativeness, and so on. Because of all these difficulties, of course, ramming conferred like the victorious admiral an enormous prestige, like someone who really managed to outmaneuver the enemy at a bigger scale, and winning the battle on top of that was really considered a very good naval commander. Now, limited signaling capacities and their short range meant that a line-abreast fleet could only follow a preset strategy or execute a narrow set of pre-planned responses. In contrast, a line-astern formation with the flagship at the forefront could swiftly adjust to the admiral's orders, however, sacrificing the capacity of simply pinning the enemy and still basically cutting through their lines without necessarily being able themselves to simply reform at that point, so making this engagement escalating to something very chaotic at times. But again, at large, a line-astern formation is rare, especially the bigger the fleet is. A closer look at the Diac is valuable as it exemplifies the apex of maneuvering strategies and provides a foundation for counter-tactics used by admirals who favored boarding methods. Because, of course, if you look at the Periplus, well, you're simply outflanking the enemy in a way or another. You can be lucky or better than him or both. Like there might be just a chance to do so. Maybe it's just a random squadron passing by and falling into the enemy line from the rear, while the opponents are pinned by a friendly, your own friendly ship line. But the Diac is something else, because you're literally going to smash into the enemy frontally, and in order to prevail, you must be pretty darn good at it. Also, at that point, if you succeed, you will be able to achieve, in fact, that outflanking maneuver without the limits posed, especially in terms of time and broader coordination capability, which means that if you break through the enemy line just by operating yourself as a line, or maybe some backup like a double line behind, but not really a column, it means that you're, of course, better than the enemy at that, and you can simply outflank him in this sense without needing to take all the time to row around the enemy formation. So let's make a very small example with just a couple of squadrons facing one another. So imagine you have the white squadron in a line-abreast formation and the black squadron in a line-astern. Right, so the whites are in a line, the blacks are in column. Right. The latter, of course, are ready to perform a Diac plus, that is to say, they have adopted that formation in order to break through the white line. So the black squadron advances quickly at speed, because they're literally charging. This is obviously the physical point of smashing as strongly as you can to properly unhinge the enemy formation. Right? Of course, there is going to be some structural damage to both ships, but the ram, first of all, is designed to properly dismantle the enemy hull, and all breaking through, also like breaking the oars and so on. You will take a very strong blow, but if you are on the opposite hand, you will, of course, be much more unlucky if this ramming is correctly performed. But at large, it's mostly about opening a gap in the enemy formation. Again, this example is abstract, meaning that, again, just per se, the thing doesn't necessarily equate eventually. So even if you, to a victory, like even if the black column manages to break through the white line, just like in open field, we have talked about this, for example, recently in the video about linear tactics. It's in many ways the same, like the eternal question, the vexata question, the grand querelle of column or line. And you understand that at large the line prevailed. And this is true also at sea, right? So even if you break through, again, what do you do exactly with that column? Is it easier to eventually operate in the moment you have broken through? Mostly, let's say the context where this should be placed in order to be sort of a more important tactical achievement is when you have someone who is capable of capitalizing on the enemy, on the gap formed in the enemy line. And so to pour other troops, right? So creating an asymmetry that increases. If you have, like in this case, the same amount of ships, it's a bit of a problem. And actually, at this smaller unit level, more things can happen in terms of galley versus galley in ways that you can't even properly predict just by the maneuver. Because, again, these two squadrons, aside from one is white, one is black, they're really never going to be identical also in reality. There is always going to be a different type of ship, of commander, of crew, of motivation, of general precondition that will at large make the thing. Nevertheless, again, tactically these maneuvers are important. They will be able to, if properly performed, if there is an opportunity to perform them to begin with, which is not necessarily the case, or at least there may be, but there may be extremely, let's say, disadvantageous in certain circumstances, they will make the tactical balance tilt in favor of at least those who succeed. We will see now that there are some counter maneuvers as well. Naturally, if in theory you could smash into one another. I'm not really familiar with any case in which both formations were trying to cause a direct plus to each other. Mostly the sense is like in battle lines that, yes, the broader lines are smashing into one another with that purpose, but it's mostly just one section of the line. This is more likely to happen. For example, the famous pig snout formation. It's not really like a triangle in which people break into like with a single guy in the front. It never happened. Like mostly that is an advanced portion of the battle line that is the one that is tendentially meant to break through because it's more elite. And so it seems like if you align the squares along the specters, it's like an arrow, but it's the formation at large. It's not really that. It's always the same degree. It's just a section of the line, not a specific point. This is going to be in a similar way. So, tendentially, you have also ships going at different speeds to begin with, right? Let's assume here that the black squadron is advancing quickly while the white squadron moving at a slower pace, right? The latter may be actually needed in order to maintain cohesion and being sort of more prepared for not to lose the formation. It is true that, however, in order to counter an enemy ship, you will have to mostly oppose yourself physically in that way. So here again, the reason why these guys may be slower is because they want to count on their line being maintained. So essentially the black flagship would aim for a gap between two enemy ships and makes a sharp turn, bringing its bow to hit the port side of one of them, right? The port side is the left one. So what happens after impact? The black flagship has maneuvered to port, which means the action of turning or steering a ship on the left, so as we see the port side, when facing forward, right? And is gaining momentum again. Because that's the purpose. You need to hopefully smash into the enemy without getting also stuck into him, causing this damn hit and run, right? So the ability to get also this guy out of the way, so managing to eventually row further and curving and falling onto the enemy rare, right? So the white ship that had been hit had also lost its port oars if the attack had been led really well, and which will have some consequences because the ship, unless they are chained together, will not have the capacity to simply maneuver like the others at the same speed with the same, or at all really, if not at least an unlikely velocity. And due to the combined impacts, this ship has swung around to port in this severely damaged condition, potentially and hopefully from the black side with a leak as well. So also part of the crew has to be mobilized to try to save things in the meanwhile. At this point, the black column has some choice, and that falls especially on the second ship behind, following like the flag one. That is, you can, for example, finish off that damaged ship, or you can shift focus to launch a ramming attempt at another white ship, which may have, for example, turned to the starboard side, with this asymmetry that again offers you this opportunity for further damage. Plus, there is, in theory, here we don't give a complete number, but let's assume there is a third black ship that again provides support. Remember, this column is launched at speed, so they will actually have just some time. This is a disadvantage. The whites are basically sitting there and more or less trying to counter these maneuvers, while the blacks, if they really want to maintain cohesion, they don't want the flagship to go too far and remain isolated, for example, because mass here is important. Like, you have to maintain formation, or at least cohesion at large, have less time to decide what to do individually. And remember, since they are a column, they depend on one another, like a domino effect. Meanwhile, however, here, considering that the Ekplus fundamentally succeeded, white ships are not in such a great position. Part are damaged, part are really exposed also to the rest of the black column. If, for example, the white ships wanted to turn to attack the following black ships, they would expose them to still some of the posterior ones, right? You want, say, to attack the second one, is encountering the third one can intercept you as well, and you're not at speed enough. You are also sort of breaking the formation. So this is why it's all unlikely to have really happened really in this sequence. At that point, it would have been better to just try to perform the same on the enemy, or at least to will the entire formation of one another, rather than trying to disrupt your own line for what in fact it was still intact, to simply run after these guys that are just performing this ramming at full speed. Of course, if we give instead this scenario for real, assuming that the black squadron would have maintained enough cohesion, it would have been in favor at parity of condition, numbers, etc., in a melee situation, because they would be able, for example, to capitalize on their speed as well. Even when we will about to fall on the enemy radar, you're still using part of that momentum from the previous ramming. The steering could be performed, we've seen it in other videos, like in very small spaces actually, and of course the smaller the better the crew in many ways. And here, of course, there is a pre-existing damage among the white ships, and so of course, even if this ended in some sort of 1 versus 1 engagement at large, the blacks would have obtained an advantage from the charge. So this is essentially the logic. It's like in open field, right? You don't have a cavalry unit being charged by another cavalry unit remaining still. Doesn't make any sense, right? Here it's relatively similar, at least you can't be, infantry trying to stop cavalry, because at the end of the day it's still muscles to muscles, right? So regardless of how these are distributed between men and horses numbers and speed, etc., you may have means to actually cause damage by breaking the enemy attack. As we will see now, it was possible to break the Ekplus. It was in fact such a big deal if succeeding. You understand also that as on land, the most important role is covered by the file opener, in this case the flagship, right? In executing the initial breach among the enemies, a maneuver that again demanded exceptional skill, because it's incredibly difficult to maneuver that enormous mass hitting precisely at speed that part of the enemy ship that allows to deliver the greatest blow without receiving. The same, it's again an incredibly complicated thing. It's also physically counterintuitive because again, if you especially want to sink the enemy, you have to literally smash into it. You have to come 90 degrees at its flank, breaking the hull, and at times some galleys would go down after having rammed the enemy because they would remain stuck into the sinking foe, in fact. So the Dick Plus is straightforward. I'm stronger, I punch the line and break it, but it's also, like in warfare, difficult to do. It's conceptually simple, but that's exactly why it's practically difficult. Remember always von Clausewitz, there is no diversion from basic strategy, right? You want to deliver the greatest blow, you have to punch the enemy in the face, right? And then, again, if the enemy, for some reason, finds himself in a condition of weakness, you can, of course, deliver that blow from a side that will hurt him even more. But at that point, you have a previous advantage, right? So it's not technically the same thing. And remember, the bigger the engagements, the less likely it is for the enemy to be in that precondition of inferiority. The odds tend to balance. So the Diac exemplifies this key tactical approach, and following its emergence in the art of war, naval tactics developed mainly as counter-strategies against it, and similar tactics employed by adept fleets. The initial response to the Diac tactic was developed swiftly. There wasn't even a moment in which, we invented this and then, now we find the countermeasure. They developed in parallel. They always existed. Even among canoes, this would have happened, like in prehistory. The defending fleet placed a second line of ships behind the first. You would think, oh my god, Diac Plus, such a griffin. Literally place a double line. And of course, you can't always do so, because you may have too few numbers, but remember what we said before. The enemy may have at that point also a few, and so even if they are deployed in column, which they rarely ever do, and you in line, does that actually place anyone in a condition of actual inferiority? As a matter of fact, at that point it's the column that will have sort of more problems. Also consider the energies that the crews, like the adrenaline, the entire effort, right, this persistent rowing at greater speed, that those are energies that you can't recover in the short medium run, and so you will be indebted for them during the course of the battle. The enemy may be in that situation more passive, but still fresher and able to spend more forces. But if you really are able to deploy multiple lines of ships, which is usually the case, you realize that given that the centrality of the first ship in the breaking column performing the Diac Plus attentively can't be stopped simply by this at large. I mean, it could have happened that you had an exceptional ship and crew that could simply break through double layers of enemies. But it's unlikely, right? And the ship has that physical limitation whereby even if you manage to break through the first line of enemy ships, you will be spent and you will have lost momentum, and you can simply be stopped by the second. And then what do all the guys behind you do? They have to stop. They are inservable, at least for that specific maneuver. It's also very dangerous because you can literally smash. You have to smash somewhere, right? And if, say, the only place where by following your file opener was the one in which his smash was blocked by the second line, you do not even have an advantageous place to smash it, so you have technically to stop, which is very difficult, and just redeploy, and that's also very disadvantageous in that situation. The enemy can actually charge at you in the same ways. So you understand how difficult things are. There is no easy way out of this. And in fact, when multiple ship lines existed, the attempts to execute the Diakoplus were effectively rendered suicidal, as any ship attempting it would be exposed to a broadside attack from the enemy's rear line and likely to be rammed. Because, as we've seen in the Diakoplus, you don't just pass, we'll talk about this, you don't just pass through the gap that does exist between a ship and another. We discuss this all the time also for land battles. It's not like that battles were won or lost because there was a natural gap between a unit or another. Those were not tactically exploited. When you break an entire line, you make an entire unit collapse, that's a thing. Like in this case, you've managed to knock a ship out, right? The space between them is designed to mostly put those who gets into that in a condition of unspendability at best, and of inferiority most of the time. Especially if, again, it's just a single guy. Imagine, I don't know, the silliness of this reasoning by acknowledging that, like, if, naval tactics had been about passing through each other's ships without clashing, you can see this massive fleets charging at one another and passing through one another without damage, and emerging intact from one another, passing by. Like it doesn't make any sense, right? So when you practice the Diakoplus, you are at an angle, which means that the ships hopefully you will have smashed into, again, the first ship, and therefore turned it as well. But at that point you will be asymmetric compared to the ship, the enemy ship behind, that can charge at your side at that point. So it's all very complicated, but without mentioning, you can literally smash yourself into that at an angle that will damage you and will stop you, will literally block you between the enemy lines. It can be, and it would have happened, right? It would have happened. I'm sure that there were crews and Marines that made it out of there by even succeeding in combat in that situation. But it's so statistically rare that tactics and formations were not about this to begin with. There is also another factor we were hinting at before, that if you establish a double line of ships, you can dangerously reduce the distance between the wings, making it simpler for an adept fleet to carry out a periplus maneuver instead. But this happens only if there is a significant disparity of sort. And again, at that point, it would be just ship versus ship. And yes, the Diakoplus could have been done in the sense that tendentially enemy galleys tended to break through. But as we've seen in bigger engagement, the most important thing was maintaining the cohesion of the line. Even when breaking through, exploiting those breakthrough to just fall on the enemy rear and sort of disarticulating it further, ship by ship, so that, like in battle, there is a section of the line that collapses. And so you will exploit that by also pressuring the enemy from another flank that now is exposed between this broken section, and going on like that. Now, a notable advancement of this strategy was employed by a Corinthian admiral named Machaon, who faced the Athenian general Phormio in the Gulf of Patras in 429 BC. And this is almost a paradox of how things can happen, but still bringing us back to the same point. There is no easy way out of things at all. Machaon essentially reduced all the disadvantages of a potential outflanking maneuver, and also a breakthrough one. So ideally countering any Diakoplus and periplus. What he did was arranging his ships in a large circular formation with the prows directed outward, while keeping 5 ships in reserve at the center to counter any Diakoplus attempt. Meaning, literally, you can't outflank this formation because it doesn't have a flank, it's a circle. And inside, you will have ships that can basically just intervene, and also proceeding more easily by internal lines in terms of maneuvering to crush any enemy ship that manages to break through the first line, the circle. Right? Think about the Scottish Schildred. Had battles like Bannockburn. It literally happened in similar ways. You had the circle of pikemen that had to stop cavalry, the main force, and then if somebody broke through, you had lighter troops, but also with, as you know, bludgeoning weapons of some sort that would have been useful to finish off a spent cavalryman that had been somehow stopped by and also just normally isolated in that first breakthrough. Right, following, in fact, the English cavalry circling around the Schildred internally, right, the same line. This is exactly what happened. What the Athenians respond to the Corinthians like, because Macon had in this way set up both a secondary line and protected the flanks, making it resistant to being broken if maintained properly. Nevertheless, the Athenians, at this point, this is one of the few cases which you would have an actual line-astern, a veritable column that maneuvers, however, from a straight line to forming a circle around the Corinthian circle. So effectively, the Athenians here, they have an advantage. That's also the reason why the Corinthians would deploy in that hyper-defensive formation. Always remember that there is an intrinsic advantage in defense, and the Athenians at this point encircle literally they row around the Corinthian circle, very much like a Cantabrian circle around the enemy, and continuously presented ramming targets to the Corinthians. So the Athenians were actually luring the Corinthians into breaking their own formation, saying, "Look, we're exposing our side. Why don't you ram into us and open a gap in your line? We can exploit." And the Corinthians could not engage without thus risking the integrity of their formation. But also they would have been blocked there. So that also shows you how, generally speaking, there are some preconditions in terms of strength ratio that have sort of brought to this. You could think, oh my God, like the Corinthians had found the ultimate formation, and then for what? For sitting there without initiative? That's literally the worst thing you can do. It wasn't over, but it was still something that you can always counter in another way, especially if you leave the initiative to the enemy. In fact, the Athenians have also the opportunity of gradually compressing the enemy circle. It's not easy, right? From the Athenian side, it's risky as well, but they are the better sailors, so that's also why they can afford this. And there is luck, as we were saying before, for every victory that manifests in a breeze that picked up as anticipated by Phormio, by the way. So it's luck, but informed luck, let's put it in this way, which combined again with the previous encirclement and pressure leads to the Corinthians losing their formation as ships began colliding, allowing the Athenians to launch their attack. So while the Corinthian formation ultimately and tactic ultimately failed, they will remain committed to countering Athenian strategies in the future. There wasn't much to do against the Athenians in that context, right? But you have the Hellenic mindset, always trying to find these conceptual ways. And just by the way, just for understanding like the practical capacity of these admirals, think about Phormio being able to foresee the outcome, or still being confident in pursuing that tactic in order to defeat the enemy. It's not just an attempt. It's as if at that point, by sheer experience, you kind of understand what these forces are all about, and you can conceptualize them in a way that, of course, if you're an average person who never thought about this, never even knew that this battle had happened, you wouldn't even know where to start from, right? And it would have been, again, even simple in Phormio's mind, except it was difficult to perform. But he had a fleet that could afford that. By the way, this is so unique. All right. What also fascinates me about military history in general is that there's never a battle that is literally identical to another. And you can see here how creative actually this battle is, because ships actually do provide with that. It's as if you had some floating fortification. It's mobile, but in that sense, it's, say, troops on land wouldn't really be able to do what these ships allow you to do. Let's see, really, it's really a different dynamic. And again, you would have not had much of this same identical type before we drew a parallel with Bannockburn, but in that sense, it's also a bit difficult. It's not quite like a vertebral circle around the skilter in that case. So in any case, because there is a functionality there of a unit that is made up of men that must maintain alignment, right? Marines or crewmen do not have to maintain alignment. It's the ship that must be maintained aligned, and so that is just a single piece, right? It allows you to operate in very different ways. Then we know, still from the classical background, of an individual named Polyanthus, also from Corinth, devising a tactic for dealing with Athenian vessels in at least constricted waters, which had a direct impact on the Athenian defeat in the harbor of Syracuse. This tactic involved reinforcing the apoditus of the Corinthian ships and intentionally seeking a bow-to-bow collision. The apotis is the singular apotides in Greek, and sometimes, like, historians have wondered what this expression really meant in this context. All right, sometimes it's translated as cat head, but it actually refers to the forward cross timbers at the front of the outrigger. Now, what is this? So, in ancient naval warfare, this was particularly true actually regarding outrigger canoes. The forward cross timbers at the front of the outrigger are often referred to as the ama, or outrigger float connections. And the ama is the buoyant component that extends from the main hull and stabilizes the vessel by providing additional lateral support. The cross timbers or beams that connect the main hull to the ama help distribute forces and tensions, maintaining the structural integrity of the ship while ensuring stability during navigation. And the arrangement and design, of course, of these components were crucial to enhancing the seaworthiness of the craft, but also literally smashing into one another in this very fiercely contested engagements. Right, so comparatively, the Athenian vessels were designed to minimize weight in these areas. Also, because of that quest for speed and agility, unlike the Corinthian ships, who enhanced the bows and apotides effect of their ships to withstand and damage Athenian vessels in head-on collisions, while sustaining minimal damage themselves. This also is interesting, but if you look at it, it is really just something you can use better in constrained waters, because guess what happens in open waters? You're even heavier than before, and so the enemy can outmaneuver you much better. So in constrained waters, and you must, of course, create the preconditions for an enemy to bottle himself up into that, right? So you must be very good at so many other levels, mostly strategical ones rather than tactical ones. But at that point, yes, if you have these lighter vessels you can smash into in close waters, well, you know, it's like shooting on the Red Cross, right? And therefore it's not really just, also in this case, the winner. Again, nobody's really stupid, in case you didn't notice, except contemporary people, and not even, say, just, of course, at war people tend to sharpen a bit their mind as well, but the average strategically literate person doesn't make that great mental gymnastics. Now, during the aforementioned encounters, of course, the ship's stem would typically land on the enemy's apotheosis. If that structure were compromised, the outrigger on that side would become incapable of supporting the oars. A severely outmatched fleet might choose to beach their ships stern first towards the shore with their prows facing the sea, engaging in boarding actions against the enemy. However, this layout posed a challenge due to its complete loss of mobility. We've actually seen it recently. At that point, it was mostly trying to defend, in fact, themselves, but involving also amphibious operations for that matter. And the opponent at that point would mostly focus their forces on a specific segment of the defending line, thus rendering this, say, amphibious fortress pretty much static, but not necessarily much less hostile to take on. Consequently, a more refined approach was to adopt a convex formation, in this case positioning the end ships to flank the shore while still remaining afloat and allowing some movement behind the center, right? And this was actually better because it allowed you, like, it secured your flanks, and it still allowed for mutual support, even some countering naval countering capacity, because they were properly in the water, floating in part. This in fact, from the side that would face the open waters, rather than if you had to attack again this formation from the flank, you would have to reach the beach itself, the shallow water. So there are interesting cases. This guy doesn't really, in fact, change too much, right? But at that point, again, it's not much about the tactics. It's why you're beached, for example, and somebody could land forces somewhere else and taking you from the rear, from land. It really depends. We've seen it at the Battle of Kyzykos specifically, and that said, no effective counter was established for maneuver tactics conducted in open waters. Right. The challenge of applying such tactics increased with a greater number of ships involved. Rather, as always, the smaller the engagements, the more varied the outcome. A formation of 100 ships in double line at, say, 50 meters intervals could present an uninterrupted front of 2.5 kilometers, wherein only the flank vessels would be susceptible to maneuver tactics, as we pointed out before. So this for the Periplus. The Diactylus was still there. And how distant were actually ships from one another in line? Well, typically 20 meters, when both sides were preparing for boarding, especially. So it's actually not such a thin space. It's what basically a ship takes sort of pass through, as we've seen. And so, as we were pointing out before, this did not really entail a weakness of the formation at all, because even when you pass through, what do you actually obtain? Right? It's much better to take on the enemy, to smash into him, and to alter the whole line than simply sailing through. And that's what the Diactylus is really about. It's not about passing through, it's breaking through. Right? As you understand, this much information is connected with classical Greece, because this is a time and place in history where historiography is really written by those same citizens and soldiers that participated to these clashes. There are other few times in history when you find these conditions that in fact usually reveal so much about warfare, to the degree that we will like in fact to often know about the rest actually of more advanced systems. In fact, we were talking about Hellenistic navies before, understanding how few we know, and comparatively it's the same with the phalanxes. Like Hellenistic warfare is much more important in a political and strategical sense, at least considering the absolute amount of forces involved, to classical Greece. However, we know much less, because more or less the soldiers and sailors employed by the Hellenistic kingdoms didn't have much individual liberty or just extraction, like cultural background, to simply dedicate themselves to historiography the way a much more directly involved citizen soldier would do at the command level to some extent. Now, Hellenistic navies preferred boarding tactics. Do you know why? Well, because of course the Hellenistic kingdoms were bigger, and so as the Macedonian armies were bigger than the classical Hellenic ones, so the forces put at sea were larger. And of course, at that point, if you can't field so much force, you will field also massive ships, which is like saying it will also use on land elephants, chariots, next to the incredibly expensive Macedonian phalanx. And when you have this veritable giants of the sea that we will see in the actual military historical units, you're so big that nobody can take you out, even by outflanking you, right? Unless, of course, they are bigger ships, but in that case, they will not even need to outflank you, because it would be extremely much more expensive in relative terms than for smaller vessels that, however, are useless against the bigger ones. And so at the end of the day, it's just this enormous floating fortresses that smash into one another and take each other out by storm, right, with the Marines. And that was literally the main desire of the Hellenistic admirals, accommodating as many Marines as possible, which significantly influenced, in turn, like the increasing size of warships. This is very fascinating, also considering that you couldn't fight as a Macedonian phalanx on the ship's decks. But that, of course, like the Hellenistic powers had enough melee troops as well, which shows you also how much more recent the choice of relying again on that enormously expensive but still very effective system like the Macedonian phalanx was. Made multiple videos on the topic, including the dreaded one of the comparison with the Manipular Legion. We talked about Pyrrhus recently as well. And in many ways, these Hellenistic fleets mirror a bit the same issues that are usually pointed out at large for the Macedonian phalanx. It is that they're very effective, very strong. You can't break them frontally, basically. That they're so very expensive, and at large they can't move more than much. So actually, like if you have enough forces that can take this single ships at a time, you can achieve something. It's just like the Mediterranean now is fundamentally, at least the Eastern Mediterranean is fundamentally Macedonian, at least of the Diadochoi. And there isn't much of an encounter against other enemies. Right, the westernmost you go, also with Pyrrhus, as we've seen, there wasn't much of a naval clash with the Carthaginians. Actually, part of the reason why Pyrrhus abandoned the island was that the local Siciliotes did not want to use their own ships. They didn't want to pay, like as always. Like they were about to knock out the Carthaginians out of the island. They needed to blockade them from sea. They don't pay, so word for you. Like the Carthaginians would remain there, and the Hellenes would suffer from that. In any case, larger polyremes did not confer marked advantages in speed and or maneuverability compared even to smaller vessels to a degree. Like, in fact, it seems that triremes and quadriremes likely were the fastest and most agile ships of their time, as well as the more habitual. The Hellenistic kingdoms have this gigantistic obsessions, and of course we all remember the Hellenistic military engineering for literally creating some of the top monsters of technological feats of the time, but being of relatively useless character in the more conventional type of warfare. In fact, it was also about the same Greeks a bit servilologically overthinking about limits, extremes, abstract ideas, and so on, but not really fighting necessarily just with that. By the way, with the Hellenistic era, you have at least the full-scale employment of dart and stone throwing engines. I made a video about the Gastraphetes and early artillery that can explain to you how the thing happened. A little bit, it was happening a bit actually all across the Mediterranean. The first still Hellenic engines, but ever used in an actual theater, were in central southern Italy by the same Romans against the Oscans. So that gives you an idea of how weird sometimes history circles. In any case, and we shall make more videos about ancient artillery, the latter wasn't much of a problem solving. Artillery was fundamentally employed to pepper the enemy fortifications, even enemy ships in this case, but they were not decisive at all against like the full might, like the speed and of the ships and the force of the marines. The average person today in the 21st century would think technology again solves everything. It didn't solve a good anything. It's not like throwing ballista bolts to a ship was sinking it faster than ramming. So let's not even begin that. And as we've seen, ramming wasn't even the more effective prevailing tactics. It was boarding. And it's always about disemboweling the person in front of you that actually makes things done in warfare. So let's talk about concrete, essential hierarchy of values and power and objective reality. In any case, this artillery, now board on ship, provided effective sometimes against vessels. One case was mostly from land batteries, but also in that case, either the enemy came too close to the shore, and how did you even bring the artillery there? They would have been at that point, yes, if it were missile, yes, but if an enemy, you couldn't attack them just with soldiers swimming from the beach to the ship. But say, why would a ship pass that close? Because most of ships did coastal navigation at the time, but not literally at artillery range from the coast. It's not like there were batteries of catapults all across the shores of the ancient Mediterranean to take down fleets. There were some choke points where, I don't know, harbor entrances, straits at some point that, I mean, very small places at large that could be effectively protected by such artillery against the same ships. Think about Archimedes against the Romans at Syracuse. But you know how it ended even in there. Like that's not how you won battles. You can imagine what was the correspective effect of mounted artillery. It was too few. More than else, missile in naval warfare was employed with incendiary purposes, which is also very part of the reason why the ships operated without sails. When artillery was affixed to vessels, its primary role was supplementing boarding actions. Right, so some sort of supporting, accompanying weapons. Right, you have the Marines boarding the enemy ships, and so at close range you mostly target, I don't know, the enemy commander there on the enemy deck. A sufficiently large stone thrower capable of substantial ship damage was too heavy for a battleship to carry in the first place, would have actually caused major imbalance in the same ship. And there were right? Especially for larger Hellenistic monster ships. But again, even there, like, it becomes even less useful, because in order to have a structure that supports it, you have to reduce the range, properly the angle of fire, the same catapult, and so at that point, what's the point, right? You can't even say that the enemy will board you, because at that point you would have such a monster ship that nobody would even need to probably even take it by boarding. So that's the simple reason why it wasn't like this. This applies actually, at least according to certain scholars, to a significant innovation introduced by the Romans in their challenge to Carthaginian sea supremacy at the onset of the First Punic War. We're, of course, talking about the corvus, the raven, right? This essentially enabled the boarding fleet to counter a fleet relying on maneuverability by literally hooking the enemy ships and pouring more easily, thus the marines on its decks, right? The downside of maneuver tactics was that, as we've seen, ramming necessitated close proximity to the enemy, and to address this, the Romans developed the corvus, a device designed to intercept an approaching vessel intending to ram, secure it, and facilitate boarding by Roman marines. Especially the latter function is somehow underrated. I mean, the fact that you could have this structure of sort to even partially slow down, like to sacrifice, even to slow down the enemy ramming. But also, this aspect seems to have been relatively impracticable. Some scholars suggest that the corvus would have been, just like the aforementioned catapults, a bit too unwieldy, would have unbalanced the same ships, right? But of course, there are different levels of this. We don't even know what the corvus really looked like. At least there are some proposed reconstructions. This is such a debated topic in many ways. I think that, of course, the Romans used that, but it doesn't seem that it would have been just more than a more primitive form of later grappling methods that now the Romans, for the first time, were now adapting. Because, as you know, the Romans were essentially rebuilding ships just on the model of the prevalent ones existing in the Mediterranean, because they weren't very, seasoned sailors. But as we were saying before, they had this need to bring the enemy ships at close range, because simply the Romans had the better soldiers, and they just would settle the matter by pouring them on the enemy decks. And so that's why they would have developed, in addition, this instrument that for this reason would have stood out also from a historiographical point of view. Again, we know too few. There are some reconstructions made for which we would also point out that such corvus would have multiple drawbacks, explaining, in fact, its eventual abandonment, although it laid the groundwork, in fact, for a range of similar Roman inventions aimed at the same function, collectively known as the ferrea manus, or iron hand, which existed already before. Like, nothing was really invented for the first time, right? The methods of naval warfare existed in the same form, essentially, in the pre-industrial era, pre-gunpowder era, since ever, right? But if we follow Polybius' accounts on the corvus, we would have this essentially 7.3 meters long, 30 centimeters diameter pole with a pulley at its top. The pulley was positioned at the ship's prow, allowing the gangway to be raised or lowered, but also optimistically elaborated to be actually effective on such a ship. Remember that it's Polybius talking, so this is a Greek that likes this technical ideas and so on, right? But the gangway would measure something like 12 feet. The gangway would measure almost 11 feet in length, featuring an oblong opening roughly 3.5 meters from one end that accommodated the pole. When you look at this size, you realize on the basis of the average 20 meters distance between ships in line that likely the effectiveness of the corvus was granted by the ability to simply sling it over the enemy ships while this kind of passage was happening. So it was about boarding by throwing this without previously unbalancing the ship, as this thing would have fallen on the enemy decks or structure to hopefully hook it, and so immediately allow the Roman legionnaires to be put on the decks. That it does make sense, in my opinion, to the point that in fact I don't believe it was much just of a particular fantasy. And people said, oh, so why didn't other people do that? First of all, I think they would, because we do not know exactly how, for example, the ancient Greeks in the classical period boarded enemy ships, but there were surely planks or something. At times the ships would be so close that they could simply, again, allow through their structures soldiers to jump in. But in the case of the Romans, the reason why it would have been used, because they were so much ahead in terms of hand-to-hand combat and brutal, again, Romano-Italic, warlike individual background, to be unleashed like onto the Carthaginian marines. It's not like those were just sissies. However, this specific gap, I mean, the fact that the Carthaginians, we've seen it in video about the Battle of Cape Economus, the Carthaginians would more rely on maneuvering, trying thus to elude this very often very heavily loaded Roman ships, right? So with lots of marines on board, exactly to avoid that confrontation. And this is primarily also a political issue. It has to do with how the Carthaginians would be willing to man their fleets. As we've seen, there were some shortcomings at times, and so history, these conditions may have brought to the Romans, trying to bridge literally the gap between these forces by exploiting their advantage in such material form, right? The corvus, again, I'm making it very simple as far as its structure is concerned, because Polybius says something and then various scholars try to reconstruct in different ways. Now, an iron ring would be located at the outer end of the gangway to secure the line from the pulley, while a substantial iron spike would be found beneath the gangway to anchor the enemy vessel. That does seem an effective mean of some sort, but of course you don't have to think it would always work, not just because of the the sea condition or something. In battles, marines composed of 80 legionnaires would advance to abreast down 30-60 centimeters wide gangway to board the opposing ship. Ideally, and again, we want to think that it was an actual thing, because also how do you simply counter this, right? Again, this is not much a problem of, oh my god, the Romans have thought it out and nobody else had. It's that, like, normally these ships did not really need to board in such a direct way. There would be all some, again, maneuvering, some softening up. Remember the Greeks saying in the classical era that boarding was now kind of the old method. It's all now about maneuvering, right? Of course, it's not true, but tendentially, you see that the Greeks were much less sort of warlike than the Romans in terms of proper background and fighting styles, right? They would fight in a comparable way, but not really as much as the Romans would in the same situation, right? So you can draw these parallelisms. It's likely that these means were also used by somebody else, and that they weren't generalized, so that we don't learn of that. Again, Polybius decides to discuss this, also for reasons that the Romans liked very much. It's possible that the corvus would have not ever been actually a great deal of a thing in the Roman navy, but especially the later Romans liked very much, like in this period, the notion of having been innovators of some sort. And so to have beaten the various peoples at what they were good at through this sort of, okay, we came on top and fixed it, right? And this is not what would have literally happened, even though it is true that the Romans would have immediately implemented the enemy technologies by even perfecting them, showing also how actually advanced they really were. I mean, sometimes the Romans were more primitive. They had that sort of, that more primitive does not necessarily mean more backward at all. The Romans immediately are able to create a fleet and beating the best sailors out there in the First Punic War. As soon as the chance arises, as we've seen, they have been using artillery themselves, even though they don't eventually need to use it so widely until the Second Punic War themselves, because there are some preconditions that allow them not to do so, and that always have to do with the fact that technology is not that relevant when you look at strategic quantities, and in fact the moral forces that warfare is mostly about. While ancient texts do not detail the specific disadvantages of the corpus, which is also interesting, albeit they are sort of imaginable as we have seen today, it soon became obsolete, thus showing how it may have not even probably ever been that famous or widespread. Once the element of surprise faded, the corvus' cumbersome design and restricted movement likely allowed opponents to avoid it. As Roman naval techniques themselves improved, including the capacity of carrying out pretty complex maneuvers that, however, already from this time weren't really off the table, just the Romans would mostly invest on their manpower, right? And hadn't they had that load, they would have also performed similar ways to the Carthaginians. The corvus proved to be a considerable hindrance to performance. In the early 2nd century BC, the Macedonian fleet further addressed the problem of confronting more agile ones by deploying numerous lembi. We will see them as ship types. They were even less than that. I mean, they were rather small open boats, typically manned by around 30 crew members to support the main fleet. And these lembi acted as effective deterrents against the Diaculus from one side, because they were essentially floating obstacles to that could also be spent compared to the rest of the ships, serving in fact as an additional line of battleships that could disrupt an enemy, in fact damaging their oars as well. They were also economical and easy to crew. For example, the 300 rowers for a larger vessel could instead man 10 lembi. However, not even this was the problem solver of much more fundamental strategic dynamics. The lembi were susceptible to larger ships when, for example, operating independently. Their advantages lay primarily in their maneuverability, but not much in their size and their crushing capacity or whatever at large. During the same time period, the Rhodian fleet, that was one of, again, the most advanced in the Hellenistic landscape, that they kept the Romans out for a very long time thanks to their capacity, introduced the fire pot, which we can't think having there been before, right? This was a bronze container filled with fire, inflammable substance of some sort that could be suspended from a long beam extending from the front of a ship. And if they came close, they could drop the fire pot onto the deck of the opposing vessel. Sometimes it was just a perpetually lit fire, or something that they would at least light in time for this operation to happen. The issue here seems to have been a paradox. This point, ships were coming to be a bit bigger. And for this reason, if you weren't particularly capable of equating that size, you would at least put this additional threat of fire. That was really dangerous for everybody involved to a degree. Using firepods enhanced maneuvering strategies in a sense, as the Rhodians noted that enemies confronted by fire would often maneuver away rather than engage in a direct collision, especially when confronted with a firepod on the foredeck, exposing their vulnerable side to the Rhodian rams. What could happen, however, during the impact, only God knows, and probably like the Rhodians didn't know better. If fire had been the ultimate solver, also in this case it would have simply been the major one. This was rather adding a bit to the unpredictability, but also to again the necessity of facing ever larger forces, right, and trying to keep the enemy out rather than even they're seeking much of a decisive confrontation. By the way, the enemy could do exactly the same, and so at that point, what do you do, right? This wouldn't lead the Rhodians much further, in the art of war and in general military success. In fact, the Romans eventually took over the same roads, and at that point, the empire was really dominating the Mediterranean, the Mare Nostrum. This brought to, as we've seen, like a general pacification of the seas. Piracy was exterminated at large, and the greater battles that you find, again, are not very frequent in naval history, telling the truth, themselves are mostly revolving around this big kind of ships that the Romans, in this sense, developed in the wake of the Hellenistic ones, but just in the wake of the broader political and strategic condition of the Hellenistic ones. They're masters of the sea. You can't simply have this massively concentrated naval force going elsewhere. It's just like with the legions, right? You have at this point is not necessarily giantism, but compared to later Roman times where fleets were smaller, ships were smaller, and armies were smaller, etc. Like everything was adapted to more like the general political and strategic background of the empire. A reason for which, at least the next advancement we can assess in boarding tactics in antiquity came from Agrippa, Octavian's admiral and one of the most successful men of the era, who developed the arpax. The arpax is the natural evolution, let's say, of the Roman grapnel series, or, as we've seen before, iron hands. Also, in this case, it's a simple design that we can't think not having been used before. There is a grapnel that gets launched by a dart thrower, allowing distant enemies to be pulled alongside and boarded. We can't think this would have been too resolutory as a mean either, because first of all, like we've seen that catapults on ships weren't that particularly performing. This was essentially the same thing. I mean, if you could bombard the enemy with artillery into creating effective damage, you would have done it. You can't overload the ships, the decks with this stuff, because they would have created problems to the marines, to the crew, damage the entire maneuverability of the ships. However, these means would simply help, together with others, to board, to grapple with the enemy, and to resolve the matter in hand-to-hand combat. It was a help, like some kind of accompanying practice, as we've seen, like catapults would have remained, that they did remain on ships, and so nothing radical, nothing revolutionary. The effectiveness of the arpax, by the way, could be undermined if the enemy employed scythe blades mounted on long handles to sever the lines. Even the Romans used scythe blades, as we've seen in the Battle of Marbian against the Veneti, by cutting the riggings of the Celtic Atlantic vessels. So if you are, of course, grappled by this dart tied to a rope, like cut the rope, kind of end of the problem. So even in Agrippa's times, naval warfare was pretty much the same old kind, right? It was gruesome and brutal. There are very interesting engagements, not just Actium, but for example, there's the final battle with Sextus Pompeius in Sicily. We will look at all these because they are, again, some of the few major engagements of the era. So with the full affirmation of the Roman Empire and the lack of significant adversaries in the Mediterranean at that time, and essentially just smaller pirates elsewhere, naval tactics development stalled, right? The emphasis remained on boarding. Nothing really changed. The world really knew how to fight. You didn't really have to teach them or to find new solutions to that. I made a video about Byzantine naval tactics as well, so if you're interested in the Byzantine continuation of Roman tactics, you can appreciate it from, in fact, the migration era to roughly the time of Basil II. When you look at, in fact, the later Roman period, you realize there is a shift in tactics, as we were saying before, spotlighting a break in continuity. The ship-killing ram was relocated above the waterline to act as a damaging weapon, with a greater emphasis placed on archery and heavily armed marines. The reason being simpler than one imagines. Essentially, ships had become smaller, and tendentially they needed less ramming. Also, when this was carried out, was done just like above water level, because the same ships didn't have such a draft. Conversely, what you see on land, and we made multiple videos about Byzantine warfare, the migration era in general, like for example, increased amount of missile capacity or necessity. The general, again, this reliance of hit-and-run tactics with smaller units that can perform. Sometimes they can perform really great feats, but do not have the punching capacity at the time. Also, because these resources are becoming a bit more precious, are all part of this. This is not to say, especially until Justinian, you have, and then also later in the Macedonian revival, you have quite large naval forces at large. So the essence of Galley warfare remains intact, but there are these important changes here and there that really show you how things are going another direction. There are also smaller crews, but in some cases more armored, depending, in fact, on what kind of enemy you're facing. This greater emphasis placed on missile warfare, for example, requires greater protection. The Byzantine navy quickly gained the upper hand against Arab forces on some occasions, like the siege of Constantinople 717. That was true also before, actually, because the famous liquid fire that was known since ever. Right, we often act as if this was just a Byzantine super weapon, and not just it kind of wasn't, or at least was very risky to use, and just in close waters when you know essentially where the current and the wind go. But because it burns, of course, on water as well. But it was used since ever, really. We have evidence of this in at least also classical times, and the ingredients to use it were known everywhere else. If anything, the Greeks would have refined it to a great extent because of their sort of, again, intellectuals and scientific mentality. but also in practice it wasn't really the game changer. We've seen how like in that video about Byzantine naval tactics, there aren't even such great crushing victories of the Byzantines throughout most of the period, right? Some battles are very famous, admittedly the siege of Constantinople again against the Arabs, etc. But overall, the Byzantines also often got defeated, right? So there are enormous debates. Like if there are enormous debates on the corpus about which Polybius tells us much more, you can imagine about the siphons used to spread this, to launch this apparently secretive as likely variable, in fact incendiary substance that was so difficult to extinguish. This siphon was in bronze, shaped like an animal's head, which was a purely decorative aspect of it all. Again, not really a game changer as one may think, but useful in some conditions, and still like displaying like the very advanced technology the Byzantines mastered. We could digress on the role of civilizational crisis on the further development of technology, which is a thing. It starts starting from the later empire, but also something that doesn't save the day per se, right? It's just the fruit of a particular philosophy and the need to improve with, say, more effect with lesser means, which at least for the liquid fire doesn't seem to have been necessarily the case. But even in there, the ships are vulnerable in a sense. They don't get the hell out of the way like humans. So there is a point. Remember the Rhodians using those fire pots, right? It's there aren't even properly grenades. They're like fire pots, flamed, and of course there is a substance that makes them inflamed. But here it's somehow similar, and it seems, at least we do have even manuscript illuminations showing even hand flamethrowers from the Byzantine side. The siphons were, reconstructed to a degree, and it may have been possible to launch such liquid fire at a range of over 15 meters. You can argue that it became the first long-range naval weapon to be properly employed in that destructive sense, a bit differently from the catapult bolts of the previous times that surely would have destroyed some ship every once in a while, but just out of luck more than else. In any case, this range, considering that the objective is setting the enemy ships on fire, is also quite dangerous, right? There is something about the employment of this liquid fire that does not really convince for greater advantage or convenience. On Schwerpunkt, I have a playlist about Scandinavian warfare, including all eras. There is a lot about medieval Scandinavia, but admittedly, we didn't cover too much of it, especially as far as the Vikings are concerned. So we'll have to come back on them, because the history of naval warfare, today we talk tactics mostly, at least certain means that ships use to fight one another, do require an attention a bit also elsewhere. I made a video about the line-astern, the Viking ships, right? Both the warships and the cargoes. We approach big Viking warfare in many ways, but they are also part of this, or at least they are the whole hallmark of a naval tradition. In this case, developing in the north of Europe, so in oceanic waters at large, not only. That, in fact, confers certain characteristics to the vessels that we've seen elsewhere, or rather. However, the Vikings are also famed for their naval capacity, and it's given that there were pretty warlike, and they were able to put together considerable forces, really, for the times and places. Looking at their warfare is quite fascinating, because it's also a bit of an evolution, a development of, say, the migration era one. I have a video prepared on the Anglo-Saxon ships, right, the migration era, that are similar. Also, we talk about the Germanic one, the Celto-Germanic ones, the Batavian ships, so everything adds up, and surely we will come back also more thoroughly on those at a point. The Vikings honed their boarding techniques. That was also their primary way of warfare. It really didn't differ much. It was the same thing of the battle lines and boarding mostly. They had more primitive means. Mostly they kept using bows and stones up to literally the 11th century, opting to tie their ships together to form a massive floating platform for which their combined crews, armored in iron, not entirely, but with axes like this, the spearhead, designed to chop people to pieces and break into actual chainmail with double-handed weapons, could roam freely, challenging anyone to board them. Some Viking ships, as you know, were enormous. We discussed them in the video about the Viking ship, exactly to offer this platform for literally epic clashes, almost like a feudal tournament battleground, right? Of course, most Viking ships were at large small, but they also contained this aggressive essence in them, and properly from a warrior culture. The Vikings seemed to regard ships primarily as modes of transport and platforms for battle rather than as weapons themselves. It wasn't boarding, which applies also to the Celto-Germanic vessels of the earlier era, likely due to the rough seas of the Atlantic, and also the fact that raiding warfare was carried out mostly at small, like a small unit level. It had to be swift. Sometimes probably these guys did not want to engage, especially with people who lived in sort of more advanced places that had the means, in fact, to seriously threaten them, hadn't they, in fact, increasingly coalesced, but also moving towards, say, from France to England because of the easier target at that point. Again, we'll have to talk so much about the Viking era, because probably I'm going to make some specials on this, because it must be really time we open a lot to the Viking era. So all in all, we don't see a great deal of ramming, which would have happened to a degree, right? These ships would have tried to give each other a tough time, but they weren't specifically designed to. They didn't have a ram, right, to begin with. So the study of sailing ships reveals significant challenges in understanding the tactics used by groups such as the Veneti, like this Celtic raiders. We know from Caesar's account, of course, most of the story. There is limited evidence, including for vessels, and it's likely that their main tactic involved boarding after an initial exchange of missile fire, as any other people. So no mystery there. A bit more of Celtic, especially in these fringe areas of Brittany, also the British Isles. If we talk about Gaelic piracy and warfare, it's different from the Brittonic one. However, it's in an ethnic sense, but and very loosely, and the same goes for actual warfare. In any case, we have seen in the video about the Battle of Cape Morbihan this frequently used tactic by Caesar's fleet, that is to board the enemy after severing the rigging with the sides mounted on poles that we discussed before. And the reason was that Caesar tells us that these Celtic ocean-borne vessels had such robust and tall hulls that the Romans didn't have essentially a way with their Liburnite that I made a video on to board them. Which you would think, well, that's over, right? You can't board anymore. It's over. Like, this goes outsmarted everyone. They really didn't. This was a closely fought battle. Like everyone, these guys knew their deal at sea, but essentially the Romans cut the riggings and they managed to simply, with their maneuverability, to surround these ships. There weren't also as many, being that large, and to take them out with actual boarding, which would have occurred with other means, right? Also concentrating fire on the enemy ships, etc. So, of course, there is no easy win if you don't have also updated tactics for that matter. And in fact, there isn't a great deal of, well, there would have been a great deal of piracy in the northern seas. That's yet also another context to really look at more in the future, hopefully. However, it was less important on average. There weren't great naval powers that could even just simply challenge the Roman ones. But when pirates, raiders coalesced, we know how it happened also on land during the migration era. There could be significant threats. Remember that naval warfare was always secondary and subsidiary to land one, right? So it wasn't changing the nature of warfare. Of course, raids were important, especially during the Viking era. You see finally like entire armies with very sophisticated naval culture. I mean, the Vikings notoriously had specifically designed cargo ships for carrying war horses that were actually an underrated aspect of their military culture. And so again, beautiful, fascinating context. We will have to look at them. But for today, stop it here. All in all, it's always interesting to talk naval warfare. I began to do it a bit later because I always admitted that I don't have a great deal of naval warfare, say, experience or background. I'm mostly like a landlubber myself. If anything, I have some experience in air warfare, which you wouldn't give it for granted, really. Just checking here how many videos I made about medieval Scandinavia. 29. That is not too few, but some are old and we didn't make many after. We need to make more. Let's check naval history. So didn't get, of course, the playlists are, they don't get enough views, but it really depends. The naval history Schwerpunkt playlist actually does get some view for 40 videos, right? And I'm glad we can continue towards this direction, really. I have, again, I don't really have in store right now among the pre-prepared, let's say, videos, the much of the naval history series that I want to start. It's going to be a small thing, but it's going to introduce better these various eras. Plus, I also want to start something about the Royal Navy, especially in the 18th century. I mean, it's so underrated. I discovered that there isn't much around in pop culture either. You would think that would be a thing. Instead, such a glorious military historical page. I realize when I make videos about British or English history, even more specifically, I don't get so many views. Why? Do you think that the UK is lost? Is that why you think that? I don't think so. You must start. There is a bit of self-sabotaging there, and I don't like it, as you know. We must come back to like, to praise, and to celebrate our past. And you know that on Schwerpunkt at large, that's what we do through the actual history, which does not require any further sort of embellishment or cosmetics, like to be that good. For the rest, there is naturally plenty of military history we will cover in other ways. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.